Have you ever wondered what happens when your creativity and inspiration accidentally seems to align perfectly with the trend curve? This year, for the first time, I experienced the trend cycle not just as a consumer, but also as a designer, and it definitely wasn't what I expected. Without intending to, one of my designs perfectly mirrored a trend that was absolutely everywhere on the runways this past season. So today I want to unpack how that happened and why I think that this trend showed up all across the world on different runways and even in my own independent designs. I'm Leigh, and 2 years ago I quit my job to teach myself how to become an independent fashion designer. And last November I decided to challenge myself to this wild idea of creating an entire collection in 13 weeks. Spoiler, it didn't go quite as planned, but that's a story for another video. So as I developed that collection, one idea I kept exploring was the women's textile movement from the Bauhaus, inspired by my love of fiber arts, but also because I currently live in Germany. I was exploring silhouettes that felt a little bit bold, a little bit of a twist on a classic, a little odd, just very much things that felt like me. I was following the thread of a t-shirt that was covered in geometric punch needling when the idea hit. I could also make this silhouette in a fluffy alpaca fabric that would just be totally off kilter and such a fun concept. Today we're making a very unserious fashion t-shirt. I had this concept already and I was thinking just how fun that would be to have something that was really outrageous in such a simple shape of a t-shirt with the cutout. So this is the shape that it's gonna have. This is the punch needle version that also is gonna have these triangle pieces. Wouldn't it be neat to be able to do this? Like, the punch needling is very labor intensive, but get the same effect with a material or a fabric that already has that fuzzy quality to it. And I was just thinking that would be absolutely hilarious. So it's not just a t-shirt, it's not a blouse, it's, I don't know, modern business attire for the adventurous individual. It was cheeky and a bit odd to do this silhouette in such a fuzzy fabric that's usually meant for jacket linings, and it felt very playful. So in my head I started calling this unserious fashion, and only later did I realize I was echoing a trend that was absolutely everywhere on the runways. This trend ended up being all about shearling and faux fur, but we're used to seeing these materials in linings, in very like wintry clothing, but this season they were a bit odd and completely unnecessary. There was a lot of fur trim, faux foxtails, I should say. I showed up both at Simone Rocha and at Rabanne. Diesel and Sakai had entire categories that I can only describe as like furry dresses, fur bodysuits at Acne Studios. Hodakova had a jacket onesie situation that looked like it might have actually been made out of vintage fur pieces. At Schiaparelli, they had some very Midsummer Night's Dream-esque fur pants. Simone Rocha had fur bustiers as well as the fur dresses and the foxtails. At Ferragamo, they had fur belts. They might have been wide enough to be skirts, but on top of completely sheer pieces. It was just wild this season. Like, no purpose, no logic, just there to be extra. And instead of fur being pointing towards your body and giving you that insulation that we're so used to, these were all outward facing furs. This is entirely about making a statement. As I was watching this trend reappear runway after runway, I was just completely floored that this idea that I just kind of designed into on instinct and I thought was kind of a funny feeling to capture fit right in with the general mood, apparently. So you may have noticed I have a new setup. I have a an actual cutting table. There's still not nearly enough room in this room for everything. Maybe you can relate where you have to move everything every time you kind of switch gears and whatnot, but that's just life. It's my first time officially rolling something out on the table. It's so exciting. So this material is a bit wild. It's an alpaca wool. It has the effect of being a shearling. Usually when you get a shearling, it has skin on the other side. So it means that an animal has been slaughtered as part of the process. But there's been a lot of innovation that's been done in materials to make them more renewable and to eliminate the need to kill an animal. And so in this case, this is actually woven with the fabric back. And you can see all the teeny stitches in here that are holding this in place. And on one hand, that makes it a more ethical, renewable material, which is wonderful. But then it's much easier to sew. A regular just sewing machine can sew through this, which makes it really practical as well. I started noticing it pretty immediately in the Runway collections, but by the end of the season, this faux fur shearling trend was so pervasive that Vogue opted to actually not include it in its trend analysis. It wasn't something that you need to necessarily analyze and say, oh, this was in, you know, all of these collections. It was truly everywhere, so they were just like, there's a thing that happened everywhere, and it was faux fur and shearling, so like, let's move on, because it's almost like too ubiquitous to be a trend, if that makes sense. This begs the question a bit of how do all of these major designers and also indie designers, including myself, all gravitate towards this same idea at this same point in time. And I think it's a reflection of the mood of the moment. I enjoy reading a lot of the designers' notes behind their collections, and there was definitely a unifying theme this last season about reacting to global instability, the chaos, economic uncertainty, the general kind of unease that we're all feeling. I'd spoken about this too in the early stages of my collection development process. And I think where we tend to go when we feel so very kind of insecure is we gravitate towards protection, comfort, and we even have been seeing in the past seasons like literal armor interpretations in a lot of collections that I think reflects that feeling and what we all might be craving at this moment. And fashion does tend to swing a bit towards symbolism in some of these more chaotic moments. And if we all want some sort of protection that we don't have, it's like, what's more protective than something that's giant and furry? This trend is like the most obvious bellwether that like the slingshot of fashion is going as far away from quiet luxury as it possibly can. Quiet luxury was about subtle status, and then fur, on the other hand, is historically one of the loudest status symbols that you can potentially wear. And yet at the same time, the use of actual fur on the runways is completely taboo unless it's recycled and repurposed like vintage fur, or it's faux fur, or it's renewable in some way, like a fabric back shearling. You know, people clearly want personality in their clothing again. So designers are taking this taboo concept, fitting it into the current mood of the moment, which is trying to find unique ways to express yourself in fashion. And one of the ways that that's being done is by twisting this legacy idea of fur and opulence and in-your-face luxury and making it something new and different. So thick. Like, here's your luxury, but also let's make it as loud as possible and hopefully a little bit unhinged. So you could say, like, on a face level, this feels a little bit like a snub towards some of that old money luxury concepts. But at the same time, you had Burberry's like twisted yarn coats, as well as something that was like a visible shag shearling at Dior, and also Fendi reviving their fur program, but doing it using shearling that was made to look like real fur. Let's remember here, this is high fashion. None of those pieces are going to be inexpensive. So while we can say that it might be a little bit of a snub towards the concept of that expensive luxury just for the sake of being luxury, these are also very truly luxury pieces, and their prices will absolutely reflect that. These are still pieces that are for very, very wealthy people. But the sheer volume of the use of faux fur and shearling on the runways does have kind of a democratic feeling to it. It's not just something that you're wearing in the evenings. This is fur for every day. Fur can be whatever it wants to be, according to the runways. There was a shirt dress from the brand Toga that I think actually summarized this really well, because it looks like it's mink, but it's worn just like as a top for every day. And I think that encapsulates that this is fur not for formality this season. It's just fur for fun. And that playfulness is exactly what I think this trend is all about. This reminded me of a rather unfortunate Halloween costume I'd made in college, where I took a vintage faux fur coat and cut it up to make like a bustier, a skirt, to be, I think I was like a cave person. If I still had those pieces, they, not necessarily worn all together, would have fit with a lot of the looks we saw on the runway this season. And I think that actually might be a bit of the point. This trend feels a bit like cutting up an heirloom piece, like a vintage fur coat, and restyling it chaotically to fit you and to not feel like it's, you know, your grandmother's fur coat anymore. And not just some like algorithmic regurgitation of the same thing over and over. And maybe that's why this trend is resonating so broadly right now, is we all feel like we're just being handed scraps of what we used to idolize or we're told to value, and instead we're finding just like broken pieces of a system. We're trying to repurpose and remake it in a way that suits us and reflects, you know, the world that we want to have and want to see. And that trend reflects that energy of kind of that repurposing and reclaiming. But at the same time, maybe it's also not that deep at all. I certainly wasn't thinking that deeply when I designed a furry t-shirt. But that's kind of the beauty of fashion, is that it as an art form can be interpreted to be a reflection of society. This complex kind of visceral idea that you can interpret as being articulated through a furry runway trend, or it can just be unserious fashion that you put on your body every day. And the choice as to whether you want to add that weight to it or not really is all yours. Furry sweatshirts are also very popular with the kitties. So this is my furry t-shirt with a very dramatic cutout back. The making of the piece was fairly straightforward, but I did get a bit big for my breeches when it came to doing the lining, because initially I was thinking, I was like, with the fur edge on this, it would be really lovely to have a silk lining. And rather than trying to think, how could I save myself some time and just be practical, I instead hand sewed about 90% of it, which took a really long time, only to find out by doing that I hadn't actually taken up my full seam allowance. Basically, like, the shape wasn't laying the way it was supposed to, because I had hand stitched it rather than machine stitched it. So I then went in and pulled out the inside and did some machine stitching, which was very nice. I ended up having to do some gathering to give it this nice ribbed finish at the bottom, which could be visible or doesn't have to be visible. But what having this ribbing does is it allows you to blouse it in different ways. Gives it a bit more versatility from a styling standpoint. If you would like to support me designing and sharing my journey as an independent fashion designer, you can do so by hitting that like and subscribe button. It means the world to me and helps allow me to keep doing this thing that I'm so passionate about and to share it with you. This whole fur and shearling concept emerging in my designs and on the runways has been a really interesting learning for me in terms of how, even though trends may be shared, unique visions of different designers interpreting this same idea in so many different ways just shows how unique we all are and how important it is to have those different foundations for where those ideas come from. I might have taken an idea and then being like, oh, but what if I did it in this material? It may have evolved very differently from someone else's perspective, and yet this common through line that we're calling a trend just because of the material that was used. I think that's so fascinating and has so much power in terms of how it then allows each of us to express that in what we're wearing in different ways as well. This is my perspective from my first time experiencing this as a designer, so I'm very curious what your perspective is as you're watching these runways and you're seeing a trend start to emerge everywhere. Like, how does that feel to you, and how do you feel like that's translating on the runways? Let me know in the comments and we can continue this discussion, because I'm really curious your perspective. I feel strangely like a part of things, having designed into this and then also seeing that so many other designers felt similarly. It's weirdly unifying, if that makes sense. But I guess that's just the phenomenon of collective creativity. So thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.